Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Brian Rotinger. I'm the Institute Designer here at SCI-Arc. Tonight we're excited to have Michael Rock, who is one of the founding partners of the multidisciplinary design studio 2x4. For those of you not familiar with their work, it focuses mainly on art, architecture, art, fashion, and cultural related projects. Just some recent clients include Brooklyn Museum, Knoll Textiles, and the Prada store here in Los Angeles, as well as in New York. We've also collaborated with architects such as Lindy Roy, Richard Gluckman, and Rem Koolhaas. Some of their work from the last decade is actually currently on display at SF MoMA until the end of November as part of the design series. I think SF MoMA kind of summed up their practice pretty well, and I just want to quote them on this. 2x4's sophisticated approach emphasizes critical thinking and research, and its projects encompass virtually all graphic media, print, web, and motion graphics, and environmental design. Their firm's design solutions are visually rewarding, employing rich but unexpected combinations of image, color, and pattern in work that is avant-garde, yet rooted in the context of its subject matter. So, before I go on, Michael?
Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Brian. This is my 8th city in 12 days, so if I start to slur, you'll know why. I'm going to read a short statement, and then I'll get onto the slides. A graphic design practice is more or less an aimless activity. Clients come and go. Projects fall into your lap or are ripped out of your hands without rhyme or reason. One day you're packaging architectural theory, then shaving cream, making newspapers, then wallpapers. On one hand, the supposition is that your authorial vision is so solid, so codified, it can survive in any environment from the commercial to the cultural. On the other hand, you're expected to be the perfect chameleon, effortlessly assuming your client's hopes and desires. And the hardest job may be simply remaining hopeful. 2x4 meanders perhaps more than others. The three of us partners have distinct desires, and our studio is populated by a cluster of iron-willed designers, each trying to eke out a sliver of authorship all their own. And we work with big, messy teams of people on big, messy projects. No one's quite sure who's in control, and everyone harbors the sneaking suspicion that no one is. But we never wanted a boutique. We wanted a supermarket. Our interests ebb and flow. We go back and forth between hoarding and ceding control. When we recently designed an exhibit of our work for San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, we were pressed to lay an illusory grid of order over our meanderings. That process forced us to accept certain things about our work. It's not coherent. How could it be? If there's any coherence in it, it's a coherence of inquiry. It's a litany of essentially unanswerable questions posed in graphic form. A lecture like this is just another demand to expose ourselves, in effect to say what makes our work our work. So tonight, I'll attempt that once again. This talk is called Some Assembly Required, which refers to the work. There is, I think, a trope that keeps resurfacing of products only partially constructed of clearly visible and often incompatible components. But the title refers to the lecture itself, which I'm afraid may require some work on your part to render coherent. Finally, I have to reiterate that this is not my work, but our work. And so I have to mention my partners, Susan Sellers and Georgie Stout, and then the many designers and architects who've passed through the studio over the past 10 years, and especially Katie Andresen, Chinlin Chen, Erwin Chen, Alex Ching, Alice Chung, Glenn Cummings, Sarah Gephardt, Penny Hardy, Karen Shu, David Israel, Israel Kandarian, Claire Kong, Sung Jun Kim, Albert Lee, Alex Lynn, Dan Michelson, Eddie Opara, Connie Pirtle, Dina Sue, Greg Stogden, Anissa Suthalela, and many others. So I brought 500 images tonight. In 1 hour, that means we get about 8 every minute. That's almost full motion video. So I'm going to run through a series of projects, some old and some really recent or actually in progress right now, and try to draw this connection between the early work, when this is the three of us working together, mostly on print work, and then on the later work, which is primarily, well, at least combines print work and work that happens in the environment, and hope to draw a connection between the two. So when we first started, I was teaching full-time in the design program at Yale, and my partner Susan was finishing a degree in labor history, and we decided to leave New Haven and start a practice, to stop teaching and stop writing and start making. And we joined with Susan's roommate from art school, Georgie Stout, and the three of us rented a loft and just started making work. And at that point, the work had a very haphazard quality to it, and I would like to say that that changed, but I think it still has a haphazard quality, just at a bigger scale. One of the first projects we started on was an incredibly influential project for our studio, which is a magazine called Architecture New York. And Any was a perfect magazine project to start with because it had almost no money and almost no one read it. So we were kind of free to do almost anything we wanted with it. And so at the time, we were trying to discover what we could do with a magazine where we had very little resources, and we had to do it every 2 months. So it became a kind of printed sketchbook for us to work on, where each issue became another experiment. But we set quite strict rules for ourselves in Any, only using 2 typefaces for the entire time we used it, having 1 standard grid we used the whole time. And Any became variations on that grid and everything that we could think to do with 2 colors, 2 typefaces, and 1 grid. Each issue took on a different theme or a different subject, but with a familiar cast of characters. By the time we started on issue 9, which was the Koolhaas issue, by the time we got to issue 19, they really had run out of money, and so issue 19 and 20 had to be made into 1. So we made 1 issue all with images, 1 issue all with type. One you read one direction, one you read the other. And if you look in 19, you start to see, I think, some very typical moves that are familiar from Any. So, for instance, the pages where the top and the bottom of the page are switched. Or the left page becomes the right page becomes the left, and the notes fall into the space between. Or single pages that are divided into multiple pages, with the idea of kind of books within magazines. By the time we got to the end of issue 20, the design of Any went in-house and we stopped doing it, but we came back for the final issue, the Being and Nothingness issue, which was issue 27. And it was literally a kind of unfinished issue. The magazine was covered with a diagram of how to make your own, and it was a series of uncut sheets, kind of literally the unfinished magazine that you had to assemble yourself. Each sheet had a single article on one side and a single piece of artwork on the other. Well, at the same time we were doing the magazine, we did a series of books that went along with that series. Every year, Any produced a kind of yearbook of the conference that went along with the magazine. And each one was based on 1 derivation of the word that goes any place, anyhow, anywise, anywhere. And the Any book was a similar kind of meditation on the grid, a fairly controlled typography and a fairly controlled use of the grid. But each issue then varied with a new kind of experiment. So over the course of 7 issues, when you have one idea that breaks down over the course of 7 years, or one idea that breaks down over the course of 7 books, it allows you to revisit certain ideas and also to refine them and make them better over time. And one thing we think we found is that our books got better as we went along. We learned how to do the typography better. We learned how to make better books. But it also allowed us to try new experimentations in how books could be parsed out or broken down. So here we have 7 years in 1 minute. And what's interesting when you start to look at a book this way is that because you can't concentrate on the content, you start to see the overall structures of the book, the way the book moves, and the way that things move through the book, the way that rhythms are developed, or the way that certain continuities are created. And so the underlying structure of the book is revealed because of the speed. If you watch this book, the organization of the book becomes primarily vertical rather than horizontal as the other ones, and so you get a completely different movement across the page as you flip through it. So ANY was a kind of ongoing backdrop to lots of other work we were producing at that time, but it was really the project we always went back to and always used for the site for our typographic experiments. The final issue of the ANY project was a book called Anything. And Anything was basically covered with 64 possible covers for a book called Anything. And then the main cover being a kind of combination of them all. At the same time we were doing ANY, we had a kind of really interesting opportunity to work on a book called Hiding. And this is a book written by a philosopher from Williams College named Mark Taylor. And he had seen ANY and been involved in it. And he called us and said, I'm about to write a book which is a treatise on skin. And I want to write a book where you design the book while I write it rather than afterwards. And so we had this really interesting collaboration where we would design pieces of the book and he would write to the design rather than the other way around. And so the result was this very strange book called Hiding. And Hiding is a book wrapped in a very thin skin, which covers a hard book. And the skin transforms the color of the book from the outside. And it's a series of reversals. So it starts off with this reversal between the title page and the kind of ISBN information that becomes a title page. And a table of contents, it's really a diagram of its narrative structures. And then, like ANY 27, it kind of starts off with instructions as well, how to read the book. And then the book starts off in a fairly simple way for an academic book, and then strange things start happening to it. So the text is interrupted by secondary text that runs sideways, or images that are slipped between the pages. In the second chapter, the paper changes and it becomes very thin. It's a chapter on tattooing, and each page is a tattoo with the type on the opposite side, so you kind of see through each image. It switches again on chapter 3, where it becomes very glossy, like a fashion magazine, and then it's followed by a series of texts which relate to those pages that came before that run through. And it also has a series of fragmented typographies. So the typography keeps shifting from the typography of the book to the typography of the newspaper, for instance. So here it goes into the typography of the New York Times. In chapter 4, the book breaks horizontally. So there's two books, one that runs above the midline and one that runs below. And it has a kind of strange point where it begins mysteriously again about 3/4 of the way through the book. And then in the middle of chapter 4, this strange thing happens where chapter 5 starts to grow out of the gutter, and it pushes chapter 4 off to the side. So chapter 5 slowly takes over the page. Chapter 4 pushes off to the margin, and chapter 5 takes over. And then eventually kind of disappears down into the gutter itself and ends with a single sentence. So it kind of growing out of the spine and then disappearing again. I want to show this project because that same notion that happened in Hiding of these fragmented typologies of typography, we tried to play those out in many different ways. And one of the things I'm insistent on in our practice is that our work isn't divided between the work we see as theoretical work and work that's practical, that we try to incorporate in all those things we do. And so at the same time, we did a small brochure for the kind of catalog for the Princeton School of Architecture and tried to literalize that fragmentation of typologies in a single book. So the catalog became a kind of miscropped cover where each chapter was the wrong size that didn't fit into the book. So the book becomes a kind of table of contents of in its physical form. You see literally what's in the book, and that each section has its own graphic language. So it's a book made up of parts stapled together. And again, on another project that happened at the same time, we were given the opportunity to not only design, but to visually edit a new textbook for college freshmen teaching English composition. And the idea was to create a book that used both examples of writing, but also visual examples as the source for possible writing assignments. And while any was circulated in a circulation of around 2,000, suddenly we had this thing that was going to be circulated in around 750,000 or 1 million copies. And so to work at a completely different scale and also at a different level of commercialism. The result was this book, Seeing in Writing, which is really, again, a series of fragments of typologies gathered together in a single book. So, for instance, this chapter was the chapter on gender, and every chapter always starts with a kind of found object where the idea of the chapter is embodied in the real world. So these kind of strange way of that razors can suddenly become male and female. And then it goes through a series of other kinds of found objects. So examples from the art world, and also written examples to make up the chapter. And the written examples are treated like the visual examples. They retain the visual quality from their original source, so from a magazine or from a newspaper or from a book. And so the typographies are always somewhat of a collage as well. And the objects are drawn from both high and low culture, and strange examples throughout. So this is a woman, Cindy Jackson, who's, after 27 plastic surgery, has been working her way into be Barbie. Or just strange juxtapositions, or images from the news. So this picture was from the first Gulf War, where the Army set up these kind of male and female latrines that were a simple wall in the desert. Nancy Burston's androgyny photography. And then historical examples too, so taking one thing and showing it over the course of 4 different points in history. So Seeing in Writing was a design problem and a typography problem. The book had to be usable and easy to use, but it was really an editing problem and a sourcing problem, and to try to build an argument through these fragments and found objects. The Seeing in Writing also included an appendix where we just took whole parts of other books and bound them in. So Berger's Ways of Seeing or McLeod's Understanding Comics become just whole sections of the book rather than a bibliography to literally swipe whole pieces of other books and include them in ours. This book now is in its 4th edition, and it's used in colleges all over America. Now, the next few things I want to show you is a little bit about, in this print process and this design making, how we work, and especially about how we work on these books. And one of the things that we do when we do these books is that we work typographically in the content development, but we also are working in models and making forms for the books as we start them. And so these sketches are some sketches for a book we were doing, a special catalog that went along with the last Olympics, 1 art collection and 5 different curators looking at that single collection. And so that idea of 5 voices, 1 collection, drove a whole series of different form experiments. First, simple ones of just, for instance, stacking different sections of a book together. And then thinking, if we become more complex in the way that we stack those voices together and let them start to bleed together, you start to get a book with that kind of organization, where you have some distinction, but you have blurring between those distinct moments as well. And then that led to other kinds of experiments in terms of graphic form, I think, yeah. So the diagram shows then how we start to deal with that. So one idea is to take a book and to turn it inside out, so the cover is a divider between 2 halves. So you get a book where it's text on the outsides and cover on the inside. Or a book, for instance, where you take a kind of floppy book with images and you wrap a solid book with text. So you kind of have a fish wrapper of a book that wraps the content. So one book which is extreme and another book which is sober. One wrapping the other. Or in this case, the kind of 2 Velcro books, one little book that clings to the outside of one big book, one referring to the other. This shows you the scale of the model. Or a book that has kind of expandable sections where you have text that runs horizontally with several voices simultaneously, and then in the center, a book that expands to have image sections as well. So the text sections are divided by expandable image sections. So those kind of model-making studies lead to another book that we're working on right now. And this is a new book by the Harvard Project on the City and Rem Koolhaas. And it's a study about Lagos, Nigeria. And the interesting thing is that we have a 1,000-page book written by multiple authors with pieces and fragments drawn from every possible source. And so we built then a series of models for what kinds of books could hold that eclectic of material. So the models start off with the idea of just simply stacking a series of different genres of books on top of each other and binding them together. So you can have an atlas and a travel book and a comic book all bound together, just as if you took 10 books off the shelf in one handful. Or a book where parts of it are folded inside or expand to different scales. Or here, a book where the book is a kind of filing cabinet in itself, so a tab system that allows you to access all different kinds of content. We then started to physicalize that form some more, so where all the pages became cut. So the book had a kind of physical tabbing and a structure that the page and the navigation were simultaneous. And then from that, we broke that down to where rather than having a kind of unified book, we made an ununified book where you have a series of smaller books bound together, and that each one has its own logic, its own graphic design, its own author. And so the book becomes just a stack of possible other books. And then each section then has a kind of different dramatic notion as well. The book starts with a long kind of meditation by Koolhaas on the arrival in Lagos. And it has this kind of cinematic flow of his own photographs. So you just flow from one photograph to the other with this voiceover that follows the route into the city, with always these kind of glimpses of the photographer in the mirror of the car. It's interrupted at times by sections which are collections of preconceived ideas and myths about Lagos. And so it's a series of headlines drawn from every possible newspaper with these kind of extremely ghoulish and exaggerated claims for the city. Parts of it are academic studies of certain times in history. So here, a study of Festac 77, the Pan-African festival that took place in Lagos that defined a certain period for kind of African optimism. And parts of it are photographic. So, for instance, one photographer's views of Lagos interiors. Parts of it are historical, and again, just drawing things from pre-existing sources. So taking entire pages or sections from other magazines. And parts of it are historical in different ways. So for instance, going to the archives and drawing historical photographs of the colonial city. And parts are analytical, diagrammatic sections that describe the urbanistic structure of different parts of the city. And other parts purely diagrammatic. Here, a diagram of the history of Africa in the 20th century, basically a history of coups and democratic elections. So, Lagos then becomes the kind of ultimate extension of the early work of fragmented typologies, where it's a series of independent books together forming a whole. At the same time we're working on these projects, we've been doing a series of other kinds of books, and this is just one example, which is a book, it's a book that goes along with an architectural competition. And these kind of projects are these sort of strange activities for a graphic designer, where you're part of a very large team, and you're working to articulate an architectural idea and using the book form to actually create unity from fragments. So I would say that this is the kind of alternate to the Lagos ultra-fragmentation methodology, where here's a book where we attempt to take this ultra-fragmented team process and create one unified voice out of it. And so it's a book where also I often end up writing a text that becomes a central text that unifies the various pieces from extremely different architects. So in this case, KPF, OMA, Toyo Ito, Davis Brody Bond, for instance. So you have these kind of very distinct voices that somehow have to be modified into a single piece. In this book, the competition requirement said that the book had to be 14 by 14 inches, which is a kind of awkward size. But it had this one loophole which said that it could have a fold-out. So our book is 14 by 58 feet, one continuous fold-out that continues to open and to unfold the story. So, and it also marks, I think, a certain change in our design point of view as well, because from the hyper-articulated pages of any, Uncity starts to suggest a kind of blunt and stupid design that continues a kind of blunt and stupid writing as well. We tried to actually reduce the design language to almost cartoonish level, so that these ideas, which could be expressed in very complex ways, get expressed in very simple ways. And here, where we're talking about designing a very large block in Manhattan with 4 or 5 major towers, it gets reduced down to almost the level of a children's book, where you're suggesting the elevation of an entire block of Manhattan over the FDR is reduced down to a single illustration. So Uncity became important for us, not only for the competition, which we lost, but for the development of a different way of working for us in terms of the language we started to use. It also, I think, demonstrates some things which you'll see come back many times. This, again, bringing text in, but bringing it in this very fundamental, straightforward way, recording conversations and then turning those into comic books. The unending devotion to collage, which you'll see over and over again in the work. Here, the important wintertime scene with the caribou. And then a series, a way of writing, too, which we develop more and more in our own work, taking over the role of the writer more often than not in our projects now. So while we were dutiful as graphic designers in the beginning, we've become less so now and more demanding, I think, of our clients in terms of the way that they allow us to control the content of what we do. So this now represents somewhat of a change or a turning point in the projects, because it would go now from print to more into three-dimensional projects. And this is a project which starts off as a print project and goes into three-dimensional. And it's a project for Vitra, the Swiss furniture company. And we started off that project as a kind of rebranding project to develop a new graphic voice for a very staid Swiss company that devoted to modern design. And this shows you some images from the studio of how we start working with this kind of intensive image collection, image creation, and writing combination. So kind of filling rooms with ideas, with words, with diagrams, and that using that material as the source for the work that we make. So we started off with this idea of trying to give a kind of new life to this very cool company. And often, again, we start with collage as not as a final product, but as a way to suggest certain ideas. So we start to suggest this is a new Vitra, rather than the kind of sterile scientists working on the science of chair creation that they had before. And that led to these fairly exuberant collages where we started to take some of their famous pieces of furniture and making flowers out of them, and kind of returning these objects of design to decoration. And these collages then became the source of a whole bunch of different materials we made for them, shopping bags and posters and ads, where the flower form became a kind of new identity for Vitra. And that also led to a series of different kinds of publications for them, this big newspaper for their work spirit for that year, that again had this collage sensibility, the kind of flowers returning made out of famous chairs from Panton and Privé. And then also drawing, again, our own content, writing our own content, and finding our own content for these pieces. And so this magazine became both visual content, but also things that we found. So, for instance, the right hand is the transcript from the Eames film View from the People Wall, and the left collage of Eames furniture. And so each piece drawn from a kind of different source in vitreous history. And sometimes just simple advertisements, taking chairs and making flowers. And then those led to these different experiments in their stores. So working with Lindy Roy at New York, we worked on the new space for the Vitra showroom on 9th Avenue. And part of that is incorporated a kind of billboard light box that's built into the facade itself. So the facade is part advertisement, part facade. Or for the Santa Monica store, now defunct, a series of graphic experiments in that space that included this large-scale wallpaper in the back and large-scale typography where the art label becomes wall-sized. And then you have this relationship between the real and the flat, so the real chairs and then the flat designs on the walls. And sometimes using the real thing too, so kind of taking these Pantone chairs and just stacking them or making piles of them in places. And then that also having a kind of motion component as well, because the idea that we start to develop is that the branding idea that starts at the wall then starts to affect all these different things that get made. So it has to do with ads and with magazines, with installations, with store displays, and then with things that happen on television or happen on screen or on the web as well. And so that sensibility infects everything that they produce. About the same time as we started that, we started one of our first big projects with OMA. And the interesting thing about our long-term collaboration with OMA is that we started off oftentimes working on competition entries together. We, as the graphic designers, on almost always failed competitions. And, but over the years, some of these buildings started to win. And so our involvement, which started off as basically a two-dimensional involvement in print and making books, started to infect the three-dimensional spaces as well. And as a collaborator, OMA is especially open, I think, to ideas coming from many different sources. And so it's allowed us to work in a way where two-dimensional ideas and flat ideas are blown up to a completely different scale than we're used to working. So the Guggenheim Las Vegas was a competition won for 2 spaces in the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. And so we did kind of basic identities for those 2 spaces and the kind of posters and announcements for the opening of them. But then as the project started to come together, we also worked on all the graphic design for the interior spaces of the buildings and for the exteriors as well. So the first space is the Hermitage Guggenheim. It's an entirely Corten steel box that's pushed through the front wall of the beautiful Venetian casino in the background. And Rem's idea on that was that he wanted the front wall and the sign for the space to be the same. And so we developed a system to rust the typography into the surface of the Corten at a different rate than the background. So the type is integral to the surface of the building. On the inside, in the grand lobby, the Corten steel wall on the other side of the box pushes through, and you see it behind the columns. And on that side, we polish the Corten. So on the outside, it's rusted. On the inside, it's polished. So the typography, again, is integral to the surface, but stands off in this other texture. The other space, which is now defunct, or now the home of the Blue Man Group, actually, it was the Guggenheim Las Vegas and was intended to show very large-scale art and had the misfortune of opening on September 13th, 2001. The problem we had here was, the exterior problem was to design a kind of entrance facade for a museum which is entirely interior to the casino, and where we had 3 feet of section to work with to make the facade. And so our solution was these 17-foot-high letters coming out of the ceiling, only dropping 3 feet down. So you have this kind of ceiling of typography that serves as the facade to the space. And you look in when you're here, your back is against the slot machines, and you're kind of staring underneath this typography into the huge space of beyond. And inside that space, there's a series of different graphic treatments. There's a glass bridge that moves from the parking garage through the space to the casino. And that is clad in 2 layers of glass. And we create typography, again, integral to the glass, where it's polished on one side, sandblasted on the other. So when you're coming through it, you're kind of inside the letter forms in these fragmented views of the museum. And with the misaligned letter forms give you these broken glimpses or hints into what's inside. So you kind of walk down a typography of fragmented letter forms. And those letter forms are made on reflective glass, so from the outside you see the shadows of the people passing behind them. There's also these kind of super graphic treatments on the end, where this gigantic door, 7-story door that was made to bring in very large art, is wrapped in a kind of super graphic fireproofing. And even the ceiling in the Guggenheim Las Vegas has a retractable glass ceiling where embedded with the Sistine Chapel, through which you see the brilliant Nevada sky. That led to a much more complex project with OMA, the project at IIT. And IIT was another competition won for a student center at the campus famously designed by Mies van der Rohe. And just to give you a little bit of background on that, above the gray line is the dormitories, below is Mies's campus, and in the middle is an elevated train track. And over time, the students had worn these kind of desire paths into the ground, passing under the train. And OMA chose that as the plan for the building. And the idea was to use this uninhabitable territory that's too loud to have a building as the site that would knit the old campus and the dormitories back together again. So the way that happens is to build a huge soundproof tube on the roof of the building so the train goes across the roof but is silent when it does. And our project was to, in this university context, to design a kind of graphic language for that building. And what we did was, when we started this project, we started looking at academic buildings in general. And where I teach at Yale, there's this tradition in this kind of famously neo-Gothic architecture of these kind of strange jokes that are built into the decoration. So, for instance, over the door of the law school, the professor lectures to the sleeping students. Or in the library, the student sits with a glass of beer and smoking a cigarette with a naked woman on the wall. So these kind of, in the very formal decoration of the Gothic buildings, you have this sort of lightheartedness. And so we wanted to build a kind of similar lightheartedness in this building. So we started, because it's a modern campus and a modern building with a modern idiom, and thinking of a student activity center, we started to build this language of kind of activities which grew and grew till we had kind of these 300 different activities represented for the building. And the administration also rejected a few, so we had to edit them out, though you can still find them if you look hard enough for them in the buildings. So this is the building. The huge tube is like remarkably effective. The train suddenly disappears overhead. The train track sits directly on the roof of the building, and the building's about almost a city block sized. And that's the view as you're on the train going over the roof of it, where you hardly see it. And then there's a series of different graphic things that happen all through the building. So from the simple typography on the outside, we actually found in the archives that Mies van der Rohe had designed a typeface for IIT years ago and left drawings of it. So we uncovered it and created a digital form of it, which now has become a kind of typeface for the university. And then the icons happen throughout the building at all these different scales, sometimes at a very large scale. So at the south entrance, what we call the international symbol of togetherness that you enter through. And at the East Campus, the main entrance, there's a 20-foot portrait of Mies van der Rohe etched into the glass, and you enter through his mouth. So you're kind of swallowed by Mies as the doors open and you enter into the building. And then as you pass through Mies, you see there's this wall of the kind of heroes of IIT, the founders of the university, that are also fritted into the glass of the Welcome Center. And as you get close to that, you see that it's actually made up of all those little figures. So there's this kind of close scale reading and long distance reading where the figures work at the most minuscule scale and at the scale of 20 or 30 feet high. And there's this beautiful things that happen with light in that building because the building's clad in orange glass, so it's, in the afternoon it's suffused with orange light that passes through the windows, or these reflections of the images on the different polished surfaces. And typography and design happens in strange ways all throughout that building. So sometimes just by modifying the surface, we make signs, or things stitched into the curtains. Here, curtains designed with petroblaze, where we took the tree drawings from Mises' original campus plans and blew them up to full-scale tree size again. The building's wrapped in this kind of very crude wood grain, which is just silk-screened on the outside of the building. That's the inside of the curtain, and the curtains are stitched so the light comes through them in very subtle ways. Other places in the reading room. And then when you look at the building from the outside, you can see this extremely strong color and graphic effect to the building. So, and that's partially made by this lenticular wallpaper we use, where the wallpaper has a quality so it moves as you move. And then again, the orange glass is illuminated from the inside. At different times of day, you see different qualities to it. And so this is the lenticular wallpaper that has this kind of really crazy, eclectic and dynamic quality to it as you move. Other parts of the space have acoustic tile for like the ballroom or for a room like this, where here it makes a big kind of happy face, but in this acoustic foam. And other places, wallpaper that's a kind of tufted wallpaper, so the figures have a kind of three-dimensional quality in the wallpaper. We also designed the light fixtures for the space in the ballroom, so simple fluorescent tubes and conduit. And you can see that the primary part of the building is bare sheetrock for almost the entire building. So the surfaces are intended to always feel applied. The sheetrock is always just one step away. So the joint compound and taping is exposed almost everywhere. Other places we build large-scale digital clocks that are just LEDs embedded into plastic walls. This is the stairway down into the eating pit. And then other places are wrapped in wallpaper. And in this case, they asked specifically if we have images of the students on campus. And so we use the images from the surveillance cameras, and you see these kind of nefarious students doing questionable acts and wrapping the spaces. And then there's other places that are wrapped simply by light boxes or by other kinds of treatments onto these walls. Or just simple things like the door numbers sort of studded into the doors. So IIT really is this building, a kind of true junk space building where it's really an entirely sheetrock building. The walls don't hold anything up. So the walls simply become substrates for graphic ideas telling you the meaning of the different rooms. At the same time, we're dealing with that kind of surfacing. We're also dealing with this kind of very explicit aspect of movements through buildings and wayfinding. And this project is a project we just finished recently. It's 5 off-Broadway theaters underground in New York in an old Cineplex complex. And so the chance was to create this very rough space where you're kind of guided through the space by the design. The floors become a map or a directional. And so the whole space is almost like a kind of airport runway that moves you through these different areas and different zones. The entire theater is at least 1 story and sometimes 2 stories underground, and so you have a sense all the time of the overhead space as well, which is in most places left exposed, and with a series of light fixtures we designed again that lead you like overhead arrows as well. You can see a corner of it here. And other places where the ceiling itself is a kind of scrim that accepts projection, so the ceiling takes on different images or different qualities depending on where you are in the space. So the projection is behind it, and the ceiling carries moving image as you're walking up the stair, for instance. And you can see here overhead the white lines serve as other kinds of wayfinding devices as well. And that space is also wrapped in various kinds of wallpaper and various kinds of material treatments as well. So the next project then takes that idea of this kind of decorated skin or graphic skin to the building and adds, like the ceiling at Dodger Stages, a level of dynamic content to it as well. And this is a project which is now in design development, will be constructed next year, and it's a new headquarters for the television station in Boston called WGBH. And we were asked by the architects, Polshek and Partners, to design a kind of screen for the outside of this building because it's a television studio and it sits right next to the throughway. They want to be able to advertise their programming. But it's a public television station, so they don't want to advertise it too much or too crassly. So they wanted something that was integrated into the surface of the building. So the condition is that there was an existing office building, there's television production studios, and then a new building, which is a 700-foot-long glass beam that connects the two. And that sits right next to the Boston, the Mass Turnpike. So you have this very high visibility area with hundreds of thousands of cars going by it. And so the idea is to put some kind of screen thing on the end so they can show images. And our reaction to that was then, could we somehow engage the whole facade with screens so that the whole building felt like it was a kind of display device? So in a way, being architectural at one end and virtual or informational at the other end. So the proposal and the accepted design now is a series of very thin video screens that go between the mullions that get closer together as they coalesce at the end of the building and then wrap the corner. So you have a sense somehow in this building that something's happening inside it, even though we're actually only covering a very small proportion of it with actual screen material. So the end screen is about 30 by 30 feet, and the other ones are about 30 by 1 foot slivers. And then the idea is that these screens do all different kinds of things. Sometimes they're extremely promotional, and they just tell you, they play ads. And sometimes they just do very simple, cool, quiet things. And so, for instance, it might just change color very slowly, or very simple environmental effects. They're worried about accidents, so we have to worry about speed. But the idea is that you can amplify the building or reduce it at different times of day and different times of activity. And that's the way the building looks when you're crossing the thruway. So you see the screen actually bends around the corner. And then when you're on the thruway itself, it kind of comes over your head. So you see this actually for about 2 miles. You see it before you actually get to the site. So you have this very long view of it in the distance. So then that same kind of screen structure is something that we also play with in this new project we just finished for Chanel. And in this project, it's a stairway in the 57th Street store, and it's a stairway that has a large-scale screen in front of it. And in this case, we're working with a screen which is extremely low resolution, white LEDs, and the idea is that a screen that you can see through, but also can play patterns or designs on it, and so a kind of background that changes qualities. And in this screen, it also has a kind of 2 different grid structures, a very low resolution LED structure, and then on top of that, a structure of just 8 panels of private light, so you can either be clear or fogged, and so you can affect the way that the LED looks. So then we created a series of programming for this so that basically the backdrop of the store is constantly changing or in motion. So this is just a diagram that you see the wall passes through each floor, the staircase goes behind it, and the image is playing kind of on all surfaces at the same time. So the trick then is what can you do in a pixel pattern that's only 16 pixels by 56 pixels? And so, so we then did a series of studies in creating programming that basically creates a kind of tweed or patterning that, that changes gradually as the day goes on. And so this is a kind of sped up version of it, but it'll go from playing kind of simple abstractions and variations on patterns, and then go through things that become more representational or image-based. So for instance, here it turns to snow. And then that snow will turn into something else, and it'll go through a series of iterations throughout the day. So and what's interesting about the pixel structure is that it only has, I think, 14 shades of lightness in each pixel and only 16 pixels wide. So you're extremely limited in terms of what's possible. But then that limitation actually lends a whole series of interesting possibilities. So here you can see, that kind of effect in the background. And you'll see also how the way it works, where sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's soft. And so you might see actual hard pixels where they're very clear, and then other times extremely soft ones. And this is kind of edited to, it happens at a much slower rate usually than what you see here. So here you can see the difference when the private light's on or off. And then the stairway, because when the private light's clear, you can see through it, you can actually see people passing behind it. And so the LEDs are actually in an open matrix, so you actually see through the screen. It's a transparent screen. So the kind of last major project I'll show now is the work we've been doing for Prada, and this is a kind of fairly engaged or large, complicated story. But I'll show you a series of different pieces. And Prada, again, was another collaboration with OMA. It started off as a project to originally design a website for the Italian fashion company. And in doing that process and working with AMO, we had come up with this proposal that was called Prada Vomit, this idea that the company constantly spewed out content in many different forms, and the website was just a kind of device to constantly make more and more content, more things that were delivered, but without a lot of order to them. So it was this, again, a kind of fragmentation where the user was really put in the position of having to negotiate all these different pieces. And that project never got beyond the prototyping stage, but at the same time, we started to work on the stores for LA and for New York. And so we took this Prada Vomit concept and started to work that into a three-dimensional treatment in the space itself. And so if you've been in the store in New York, it's really a series of these kind of small screen moments that are integrated through the store in different places, in the alcoves downstairs, or embedded in the furniture, or hanging demurely amongst the clothing. The screens kind of happen throughout. You find them in different places. And so in that first season, we started to develop all of the content for those screens and the videos and the images. And Rem had this proposal that the theme for that should be everything. So we took that to mean kind of everything that's not in the store is brought in through the screens. And so there's a whole series of films that represented the kind of world of fashion that's excluded from those spaces, those kind of rarefied luxury spaces. So for instance, this kind of fake sales that are going on right outside the store. The exchange of money, which is always absolutely hidden in Prada, is kind of brought in on the screens. People reselling their Prada through eBay happens on screen. The kind of street fashion, what's happening in the dressing rooms, beauty, other street fashion, beauty. So these movies were all these kind of small fragments of kind of everyday life. These are the personal ads from the Italian newspaper. This is actually right outside the store. There's people selling the fake version of what's inside the store. So you have this kind of outside-inside version going on simultaneously. So the screens became this way to bring the outside in, and also to have this infection of the rough in the incredibly smooth interior space. And we also then started to develop the wallpaper for that store. And if you know that store, there's a 200-foot wall on the north wall that gets changed every 9 months or so. And so for that first iteration where we had made all these short films about kind of street fashion and street life, we took those fragments, some of them banal, some of them pornographic, and started to cut those into a series of patterns in this kind of large-scale floral pattern. And that formed this huge wallpaper, the kind of ultra-floral wallpaper made out of these broken fragments of images. And from far distance, you see them purely as a kind of pattern, an unrepeating pattern. But when you get close, they have kind of all this strange content embedded into them. And that store, which is one continuous ramp that goes from the street level down to the basement and back up again, the big wall becomes a backdrop to that. You can also see it's done at a very low resolution at about 1 dpi, so the images themselves are very rough, but resolved from the street. So, and this shows it just with people in it and that kind of combination of color that works really nicely with people in there. So then what we started to do was that we had this space then to work in, and for the last 4 years now we've been doing a whole series of different experiments that happen in that space. So the first time that came to change the content, we decided that rather than changing the content, which it seems like what always happens, we would use the obliteration of the old content as the content. So we created this one new pattern which just painted on top of the old pattern, so you kind of just cover up the old thing and cancel it. And so this cancellation theme became a whole way of dealing with content for the next iteration. And that happened as well on all the videos. So we took the old fashion and just cut it out where it wasn't fashionable anymore, or covered things that weren't for sale, or told you what you couldn't buy. So the screens became rougher and blacker, and all the content from the first season started to decay before your eyes. Some of the screens just went blank, or they would say what they used to be, or what they really did. And some of the pieces of content, for instance, in the 23-screen peep show, we just did new iterations with the old content. So here, for instance, making one film loop on a delay, a 2-second delay between screens, allows us to have 46 seconds of film played simultaneously. So it's a kind of synchronic diachronic experiment where you can see all the frames of a film or look at the individual ones at any time, and with simply just making one loop playing over and over again. For the season after that, we in relationship to the project that was developing in Beijing, we created a kind of shopping space that drew all its content from its simultaneous shopping space in Beijing. So taking a fashion store in Beijing, and all of the video was drawn from that store. So as you shopped in New York, you had a simultaneous shopping experience in China. The wallpaper in that case was made up with kind of 10,000 people in a stadium holding up cards, so making this huge image. So you had the sense of a kind of spectators on your experience, the whole wall with this kind of army forming these gigantic images. And then for that season, we also developed a whole display technique for the store as well. So we imported 100 identical mannequins from China and created these kind of marching armies throughout the store. So you have this, you can see here in the screens, this kind of view into these shopping spaces in another city. And then you have these armies of mannequins, all identical, that play out in front of this wall of all identical people holding these cards. And then we did also an ad campaign that happens on the street, so you have that kind of repetition between the street, the mannequins, the wall, with these kind of continuous armies over and over again. The next iteration after that, we created this hyper-real, luxurious landscape of perfection populated by these gigantic figures, and that serve as the backdrop again for these kind of armies of figures. And those exist in this garish, extremely bright, kind of Edenic landscape. And that same kind of ultra-glossy, ultra-decorative world wraps the different architectural elements in the space as well. At the last moment, this wallpaper went up right when Janet Jackson inadvertently exposed her breast, and the lawyers made us digitize the digital genitals of the figures. And then again, these same idea played out on the screens throughout the store. So those same figures that exist in superscale on the wall and in these alcoves downstairs have a video component. So they kind of come to life and march around the store in these different scales, sometimes in these sort of strange backdrops. And then other times, a kind of series of different animations. Let's see if it runs. Okay. And in these ones, the kind of figures remain unfinished, so they have this kind of broken or fragmented quality in terms of the way that they're composed. And so the figures that are perfect on the wall remain kind of in process in the video. One of the things we try always to do is, as with the writing, to try to make everything we can by ourselves. And so oftentimes the technique is quite crude, but by that we managed to sort of hold on to all of the production ourselves and to shoot the films, to edit the films, to do the animations, to do everything we can without having to resort to experts. That idea then got transported to Beverly Hills when we started to work on that project. And we took those same figures that we were developing, those forms, but in Beverly Hills we created an algorithm that allows basically the figures to be drawn dynamically in each instance by drawing information from headlines from the internet. So the figures in the Beverly Hills store are always new, and they always have kind of new information to render them. And so they're also made to come sort of out of space into the store and projected on glass. So you have these kind of full-scale ghosts, information ghosts who occupy that space. So the images are actually projected into the private light glass at about full scale, so you kind of stand face to face with these figures. And then those same forms make up posters and invitations and a variety of things that we make for Prada as well. And then also we work on these various films in that space as well. And in this case, all of the films and videos are somewhat about the kind of creation of identity through these various techniques. So for instance, for the upstairs wallpaper at Prada Beverly Hills, you have one gigantic diagram outlining the average American. So as you shop for the most unaverage things, you're always reminded of your deviation from the average. And those are rendered in this extremely rough way using the kind of coarsest kinds of Microsoft Word diagrams to make up the backdrop to that space. And then we've also been doing a series of spaces in Milan for Prada, which are usually used for fashion shows. And so oftentimes those are created by simultaneous videos. So we use 14 video projections simultaneously to create a kind of dynamic space that the fashion show happens inside of. And so in this case, we created an almost Roadrunner cartoon landscape where the walls run at different scales, and you kind of inhabit this cartoon space that, and then out of the sky drops mushrooms, cactus, and bananas. Inexplicably. So throughout the fashion show, there's this kind of rain of objects through the whole time. And the final iteration in New York, which is just up, and I don't have great pictures of it yet, but we've now made that space into a kind of brand identity manual for a company called Gilt. And so the whole wall becomes this huge scale kind of program for how the Gilt identity is forwarded worldwide. And it works on that wall at super scale. So you have this super clean, very bright. So, and then the final Prada project is a project we just finished, first for Tokyo and now for Shanghai. And it was an exhibit of skirts, which didn't seem very promising at first, but actually became really interesting because skirts, if you don't know it, are the often overlooked stepchildren of coats and dresses. And the interesting thing is it's such a simple form, and so you see this design idea played out in all the ways that material and construction can take this one simple form and do all these different things with it. So the exhibit was called Waist Down. It started with a catalog that we did, and the idea in the catalog was to take this form, the skirt, and to photograph it in the most kind of banal way possible, so either flat, opened up, and all on the same scale. So the catalog has this almost kind of specimen book quality to these objects. And then working with the team designers in collaboration again with OMA, we did an exhibit design for the Prada store in Tokyo. And that included a whole campaign for the city, all throughout the city, a whole series of billboards and advertisements. And so you kind of have this repetition of these flowers again, and kind of the flower theme returns. And then the exhibit itself has all these different display techniques that are dependent on the qualities of the skirts. So some skirts that are light are kind of spin on these little motors, so they kind of float in the space, and they're always in action. And in those, we put mirrors on the floor with the typography that describes them. So you kind of look up the skirt to see the typography. And then other skirts are ones that move in a slightly different way, and those are just on a pendulum, so they just kind of shake back and forth. And they have these kind of oversized tags that hang on them. Some that are very intricate have these magnifying lenses, so you can see the detail on them. And some skirts are displayed in camouflage on the material that they're made out of, so there's kind of the hidden skirts where you can hardly make them out where they are. Some skirts are so stiff they can stand up on their own. And some aren't stiff, so we laminate those in plastic. And then the upstairs space has these huge mannequins that are 280% women. So when you walk in, you're basically eye level with knee height. So the knee becomes the kind of datum of the room. And you walk amongst these figures, the backside of which are all in reflective material. So you kind of creates this incredibly strange funhouse effect. And those contain typography as well. So you see the typography reflected in the image of the things behind you. And then that also plays out in a series of video screens in the store as well. So just a series of these kind of explosions of flowers that happen on the screens. So the last thing I'll show you then is, well, I'll show you this one project quickly, and then a couple things that talk about the codification of the work, I guess. Yikes, I have to move along. So this last project is the kind of the end of the some assembly required theme. It's a new magazine we were asked to design for a publishing company in Holland that used to publish a magazine called Arcus. And they asked us to design a new format for a magazine. And our proposal and the result we gave them was that the format was simply a clear, thin skin. Because the idea was that this would be the absolute minimum organizing element for a magazine or a book, which is that it's the one element that always remains the same, but that anything else, any kind of content can go into. So Volume is a magazine that is constantly reinvented in every issue, and it's composed of different parts each time. So what goes in the box is determined by the content and by the designers. But the plastic part of the box remains the kind of the one consistent element. And we've now finished 3 issues, each time with different qualities. Sometimes a magazine with some extra pieces, and sometimes it's a magazine plus a newspaper, or sometimes it'll be just a DVD, et cetera. So in this most recent one, there's a magazine, a bulletin, and then this large-scale newspaper done for Columbia, where a series of different experiments are played out in this kind of broadsheet scale. We contributed this, which was, we felt, the kind of ultimate manifesto, because it covers everything. So the the last two things are these projects which are now kind of about the work itself. And the first is this exhibit at SF MoMA, which we basically completely wallpapered as part of SF MoMA with our own work. And so that we take fragments of the work at actual scale and then reform it by the way we put it together in these new combinations. And it kind of happens in these strange places too, so on the doors of the elevators and on the walls of the spaces. And so you get projects which are vastly different in scale and vastly different in the time that we did them put together to form these kind of new combinations and these kind of strange interior spaces. And so IIT goes next to a packaging project, goes next to Prada, goes next to Uncity. They're all kind of pushed together. And so we use the wallpaper technique and the scale technique as a way to kind of bring all our work back together into one continuous surface. And the other project is this project we just finished for IDM magazine in Japan. And they asked us to do a feature about the studio and about the show. And so our proposal to them was that every time you do a magazine article, you always come up with some kind of conceit for it. So our article is just a series of conceits, one after another. So one conceit is to use the show at SF MoMA as a way to organize the work. So below the line is the work that it refers to. Or to create just a very simple catalog that you'd see in any magazine. Or to show work in process in a kind of pin-up wall. Or to show work purely by describing it and to show it as little as possible. So a kind of text-heavy approach. Or to take one lecture like this one and to transcribe that and let that be the way that you show the work. Or here to show things that were rejected. This was the idea that was original for Waist Down that was rejected, where we used one issue of Nippon Vogue and just blacked out all the parts that weren't relevant and only left the parts that we wanted to keep. So it was a rejected concept, but we could show work that was only rejected. Or show, for instance, a family tree of how that wall plays out in terms of all the work that happened for Vitra. Or to try to create a manifesto, what we call a both manifesto, both big and small, both rough and smooth, both full and empty, et cetera. Or just basically show all the images from the lecture at the same scale. Or show real work at 100% scale. Or show all the work that goes into making something like the Lagos book. Or creating work that's all organized chronologically. So it became basically a fragmenting of typologies and a fragment of methodologies in one article of all the ways that you can organize design work. So my coda to this all is that this idea, which is that basically when we look at our work over time and in terms of amplitude, I think that we can see that in our own studio, there's been this increase in our experience and our ability to do work in the scale of our projects and our ambition. And there's almost this absolutely necessary reverse in creativity, exuberance, and intelligence. And it seems like that's this kind of inevitable moment that happens for studios at a certain point in their life. And at 10 years, we feel like we're right at that point of crossover. And I guess that we're left with this really terrible problem of how do we turn the red arrow the other way. Thanks very much. So I'm glad to take questions if anyone wants them, or I think you can talk to me.